If you asked a Torontonian about Castle Frank, I think most people would recognize the name. They might know it as a TTC station, and some people would know that it describes an area in southeast Rosedale, right next to the Don Valley. But how many people would know where the name comes from or who Frank was? I certainly didn't. This week's episode is about Castle Frank, one of those sleepy little corners whose story touches on the man who founded the town of York, a lost landmark of pioneer days, and two of the biggest infrastructure projects in Toronto's history. I'm Adam Weiser.
And I'm Grayson Miller. And this is Muddy York.
Wow, you really put on the bass on that.
I had to do this deep. Oh, man. My character's voice was really deep this morning, so I still have it.
Okay. Gray, what did you know about Castle Frank before we started work on this episode?
Well, you know how you said you knew very little about it? I think I knew even less than you knew. I would pass the subway station. That's about it. Yeah. I thought it was an actual castle.
Well, it was of a sort, especially compared to most of the buildings of that time. Now, throughout this episode, we are going to be hearing from Bob Georgiou, a local historian who first suggested this topic. You can find him on Twitter at Bob Georgiou. That's GeorgiouTO. In this first clip, he's going to describe some of the local geography around
Geographically, it's kind of defined as this ridge that's made up on the one side by the Don River Valley, and on the other side, Rosedale Valley Road. So so between those two kind of landforms, it forms a ridge, a kind of plateau, which does an interesting thing geographically. As it moves kind of southeast, the ridge narrows and kind of overlooks the Don Valley and Rosedale Valley, and kind of creates a neat little geographic pocket in Toronto. Very interesting landform.
The hillsides leading up to the plateau that he mentioned are steep and date all the way back to the last ice age. At the center of this area is Rosedale Valley, a picturesque path sandwiched between two ravine walls.
Indigenous groups would have been the first people to occupy this area, and here is Bob to provide some more background.
Yeah, so there isn't specific presence that they were there, but we do know that they did have words for the lower Don Valley. It was called I believe burnt back woods or something to that effect. So we do know that they were around the Don Valley. There is also an archaeological site called the Withrow site near today's Broadview and Withrow, kind of north of Gerrard Street. On a side street that had an old indigenous, I believe it was a burial ground. I believe there was recently more discoveries made about that. So we definitely know that there was indigenous presence within the Don Valley. We can, although it's dangerous to extrapolate, we can potentially think about indigenous presence being on Castle Frank Hill.
In 1793, John Graves Simcoe arrived and created the town of York, which would become the city of Toronto. He would be responsible for erecting Castle Frank, the building that gives the area its name. Once again, here's Bob.
John Graves Simcoe basically granted himself a portion of land. Basically, it runs, if I have my geography right, from Parliament Street to the west, Wellesley Street to the south, the Don River to the east, and then basically Bloor Street to the north. So he granted himself this plot of land. And back then, when you had these plot of land, the requirement was you build a road on it and you build a settlement on it. So Castle Frank basically came out of that. Castle Frank was this home that they built on that particular land near the Don River.
One thing to note is that officially, John Simcoe did not award the land to himself. On paper, it was owned by Francis Simcoe, John's firstborn son. Unfortunately, Francis was only 2 years old and his business skills left something to desire. So, his father would administer the property on his behalf.
Like Bob mentioned, the land grant was conditional. Owners had to build a road to the land, and they had to build something on the land. The Simcoes chose to build a summer house. Elizabeth Simcoe, John's wife and Francis's mother, described her first journey to Castle Frank.
The government, having determined to take a lot of 200 acres upon the River Don for Francis, and the law obliges persons having lots of land to build a house upon them within a year. We went today to fix upon the spot for building his house. We went 6 miles by water and landed, climbed up an exceeding steep hill, or rather, a series of sugar-loaved hills, and approved of the highest spot from where we look down on the tops of large trees. There are large pine plains around it, which being without underwood can ride or walk. The height of the situation will secure us from mosquitoes.
The new building was known as Castle Frank, in reference to the land's official owner. The name was partially tongue-in-cheek, but it was also a reference to French hunting lodges that were known as chateaux. The building itself was something like 30 feet wide by 60 feet long, a good-sized living space for the 1790s, and was designed and built to invoke the grandeur of an ancient Greek temple. Elizabeth Simcoe described it in her diary.
It is called Castle Frank, built on the plan of a Grecian temple, totally out of wood, the logs squared and so grooved together that in case of decay, any log may be taken out. The large pine trees made pillars for the porticos, which are at each 16 feet high.
It seems like a nice place to get away from it all. Think of it as the Muskoka of its time. At first, the Simcoes reached Castle Frank by traveling up the Don, by canoe in summer and by sled in winter, and then hiking up the hill. But like Bob mentioned, landowners were also required to build a road to their property. Luckily for the Simcoes, John's position as lieutenant governor meant that he could get the army to do it for him. Nice little bonus. The Queen's Rangers cleared a path north from the Parliament buildings, which were then on Front Street. And today we know this path as Parliament Street. The road followed a relatively straight course until it hit an escarpment near the current site of Bloor Street, where it split off in two directions. One path moved northwest, meeting Yonge Street near present-day Yorkville. The second path led east, where it followed a winding path up to Castle Frank.
Unfortunately, the Simcoes didn't get to enjoy their summer retreat for very long because they left York in 1796 and never returned. Over the next few years, government officials would sometimes use it for picnics and balls. However, by 1803, Colonel Thomas Talbot visited Castle Frank and wrote about how it was uninhabited and going to ruin. It's said that American troops occupying York during the War of 1812 traveled there in search of the plunder to be found in a castle. But that could just be an urban myth to mock foolish Yankees. Hunters and fishermen would sometimes stay in the abandoned buildings, but it seemed to have met its end in 1829 when visitors accidentally burned it to the ground. In 1930, a man named Elms Henderson recalled childhood memories about the state of Castle Frank back in 1849. The original cottage, Castle Frank, remained vacant, and all that remained of it was when I first saw the spot were a pile of ashes in a small depression, perhaps the cellar, and the outlines of the little garden beds in front of it, in which were some straggling remains of shrubs. So, who was the next person to live there? Here's Bob again.
Yeah, so on Castle Frank Hill, the next real person to, or next real site to occupy the ridge was ironically also called Castle Frank. I guess it was in tribute to the earlier Castle Frank. I've named it Castle Frank too. I believe in the history books it's just called Castle Frank though. But it was by an individual named Walter Mackenzie. He was if I have his title right, he was the county clerk of York, I believe. So he was like pretty high up. So he occupied the site from the 1850s. And there's an old, in my research, I located the an old newspaper advertisement where he's basically trying to sell some lumber, some wood from the pines from the area.
When Bob said Mackenzie wanted to sell some wood, he wasn't kidding. Mackenzie placed an ad in the Globe for 400 standing pine trees. Walter Mackenzie had the first permanent home on the hill. However, he died in 1890. In 1902, a very successful businessman named Albert Kemp built his own mansion on the site of Mackenzie's old home, calling it New Castle Frank. In addition to his business activities, Kemp was an MP and became the Minister of Militia and Defense during World War I, which made him a very important person. During this time, more houses began to spring up on the ridge as Castle Frank Road was built. Needless to say, the people who moved into these homes were very well-to-do. Kemp would die in 1929, but his mansion continued to stand until the 1960s. We'll post a picture of the mansion online. It is very well-to-do.
That's what was happening on Castle Frank, the hill that is. But what was happening around it? Well, the first change happened to Castle Frank Brook, a small watercourse which ran south of the hill until it flowed into the Don. As urban development moved north, the brook became badly polluted, and during the 1880s, the city made a conscious effort to improve public hygiene by burying polluted waterways. So they shifted the water flow into a culvert. A culvert is a structure that channels water underground, like the tunnels that you see under roadways. Bear in mind, the brook continued to run, it just happened underground. Rosedale Valley Road was then built on top of it. In 1897, it was described as one of the coolest, shadiest, and most beautifully picturesque roads in or near the city. And that may still be true today. On January 1st, 1913, Toronto voters voted to build the Bloor Street Viaduct. They had rejected it in 3 previous referenda. The project included the construction of 2 bridges, a big one over the Don Valley and a smaller one over Rosedale Valley. Several buildings along Castle Frank Road had to be demolished to make way for a new strip of Bloor Street that connected the 2 bridges, including a gatehouse that had stood at the corner of Parliament and Bloor Street. It had been built all the way back in 1818 to guard the path that led to Castle Frank.
During the 1950s, the construction of the Don Valley Parkway and the Bayview Extension would have a major effect on local geography by leveling a local landmark called Sugar Hill Loaf.
Sugarloaf Hill.
Sugarloaf Hill, sorry. I just keep thinking about the Sugar Hill Gang. Every time I see it, I think of the Sugar Hill Gang, so that's why I read it. Okay.
Just so you know that almost very few people who listen to this will know that reference.
I said a hip hop. I think they would. Who knows? Okay, but let's try it again. Okay.
Young people are dumb, and we are no longer young people.
Wow. Well, then we just lost all of the listeners that were young. If they did listen to this, they're all now gone. Mm-hmm. Okay. Right. Well,
all of you young people listen to the wrong music.
I don't necessarily agree with that, but if you're still here, let's try that again.
Barry Manilow is coming in. I don't think a single person under 20 is going to his concert.
A single person under 70, Adam. Barry Manilow.
65.
Maybe. Okay. All right, we'll see. I wonder, should I just try this whole thing again? Okay. During the 1950s, the construction of the Don Valley Parkway and the Bayview Extension would have a major effect on local geography by leveling a local landmark called Sugarloaf Hill, located just north of Castle Frank. The hill got its name because it was shaped like a sugar loaf. Adam, do you know what a sugar loaf is?
Some kind of sweetbread?
I don't know. I didn't really have any idea either, but apparently they used to sell sugar in cones, and the hill resembled one of these cones. So wait, hold on. So what is it actually?
It's a hill. It's just shaped like one of those old sugar cones.
Oh.
So before now we get sugar either in bags or in cubes. They didn't do that back then. They had these sort of cones that you got it in. And so it looked like one of those.
Scott Young, a writer for the Globe and father to a rather famous son named Neil, wrote about the destruction of Sugarloaf Hill. Soon, It will be gone, and fast, bright cars on the Don Valley Parkway will stream north and south over one more vanished place where boys once roam alone. Every step an adventure, and even the crows had names. Wow, so you can see where Mr. Neal got his poetry from.
Actually, yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but you're right.
Frederick Gardiner, Big Daddy, if you remember, go back and listen to that great episode, the man who championed the DVP, responded to these sorts of complaints by saying, "I'll tell you what the Don Valley was. The Don Valley was a place to murder little boys. That's what it was." Jeez, that's aggressive. Remember that quote the next time somebody talks about how politics used to be upright and genteel. The next major project to touch Castle Frank was the construction of the Bloor-Danforth line during the 1960s. As a cost-cutting measure, the subway was going to run on the lower deck of the viaduct. However, the turns along the Rosedale section of the route were too sharp for the trains, so a new covered bridge had to be built over the Rosedale Valley to run alongside the existing bridge. Luckily for the locals, the subway track was encased to minimize noise complaints. Of course, Castle Frank would get its own station at the corner of Bloor and Castle Frank Road.
During the late 50s, the Kemp family, who owned the new Castle Frank estate, put it up for sale for the then exorbitant price of $1.2 million. Can you imagine paying that much for a home in Toronto?
1.2 million? Wow. Back then, that probably got you a mansion, a gardener, and a handshake from the mayor. Now I think it gets you a semi-detached with a raccoon tenant and a cracked sidewalk in Scarborough.
A developer proposed to demolish the mansion and build a 21-story luxury apartment building. The other residents of Castle Frank were not happy with this project, calling it ghastly, revolting, and a great pity. They were still very well-to-do and included a former prime minister, the managing director of the Argos, and the widow of the president of U of T. They put their money and their connections to work and managed to block the zoning changes required for the project. Eventually, a new plan was developed to build a vocational school for, quote, a lower middle group of secondary school-age pupils and others who do not plan to go to university. An article in the Globe described the idea behind the new school. Castle Frank and the junior vocational schools are based on the concept that slow learning for emotionally disturbed pupils have a special place in a modern society with a rapidly changing technology. You can hear the patronizing tone through all of those decades. This idea was unique enough that they actually made a newsreel about it that they would play at cinemas in between movies. During the 90s, the school abandoned this model and became Rosedale Heights Secondary School. It would later adopt an arts-centered program and become the Rosedale Heights School for the Arts. Very sketchily, the man who pioneered the arts curriculum actually holds the record for the longest-serving high school principal in Ontario.
Huh. Good record to have. So, what about the original Castle Frank? Well, in 1954, an engraved cairn was erected in a nearby parkette commemorating it. But do we know where the original building might have been located? For one last time, here's Bob.
Yeah, so I've been trying to locate this space, kind of cross-referencing, old maps with current maps, and I believe it's the current site is probably in somebody's backyard, if not, probably in some park space on Castle Frank Ridge. Going back to Henry Scatting in the late 1900s, I believe he took a party and tried to find this site, and there was said that they found ashes or foundations of where it was located. But there is a cairn to the site located about across Castle Frank Station, but that's not the site where it was. It's actually located a little bit southeast of there. But yeah, it's probably in somebody's backyard.
Well, Castle Frank, one of those places that you hear about, about where it is, but you don't really know the history about it. So I'm glad that Bob was able to share some of his insights and we were able to learn a little bit more about Castle Frank. So, Adam, That's the episode. Guys, we've been growing. It's been really great. We want to thank all of our listeners. People are writing in. Continue to write in. If you write us, we will read it out loud, kind of like some old school radio vibes. I really like that. So write us. We'll start reading some of the messages to you guys and hear all the great feedback. And please give us some great story ideas. We've been taking some of the ideas that you've been giving us, and we'd love to share more about Toronto's history. And if you want to reach us, Adam, where can the good people reach us?
Well, they can reach us by email at muddy_york@outlook.com. They can find us on Twitter or X or whatever Elon's calling it now at muddy. Oh, Christ. I will get this eventually. They can email us at muddy_york@outlook.com. They can find us on Twitter at Toronto_history. They can find us on Blue Sky at Muddy York, or they can find us on Facebook at Muddy York History. And finally, if you want to follow Bob Georgiou, who posts a regular feature about some of the more lesser known corners of our city, like we said, you can find him at Bob Georgiou TO, all one word, at Twitter. And we sometimes repost his work on our feed, so you can follow him there. Otherwise, we'll see you all in 2 weeks.